Fortuna Admissions. Welcome to the third in a fantastic MBA admissions masterclass series with the dream team at Fortuna Admissions. I'm Matt Symonds. I'm one of the founders of Fortuna, and in the past 3 weeks have had the great fortune to sit down with colleagues to look at all aspects of the application to the world's top business schools, all those pieces to the puzzles. You can find the resources on YouTube. We had a first session on the essays. Last week, it was dedicated to letters of recommendation and the recommenders you might choose. And today, we're going to focus on the resume, your CV, how to nail that MBA resume, perhaps not the one that you sent for those job applications. This is very much for business school. And of course, the application forms. The world's top business schools all share their desire for diversity in the MBA classroom. They want diversity of background, diversity of experience, diversity of education, industry, community engagement. So how do you capture that on your resume? Because after all, you are more than a job title, and listing your interests as reading, cooking, and travel, well, that might be selling you short, even though I love every one of those. Now, the MBA application wants to find out much more about you. And in addition to that CV or resume, the schools have designed detailed application forms. And it's the opportunity to share so much more of you. How are you going to grasp that opportunity? To answer those questions, I get the chance to bring together some of my wonderful colleagues. Caroline Diarte Edwards, we started Fortuna together, but only after Caroline had spent many years as the director of MBA admissions and financial aid at INSEAD. I'm also joined by Jody Keating. Jody is our resume expert. She is a career coach and has worked with MBA students at Wharton and Georgetown to get those resumes ready for the job market. And also Catherine Tuttle, one of our expert coaches at Fortuna, who herself was a former associate director at Duke Fuqua, can tell you everything about 25 random things for the school, but of course, everything you should be sharing in your resume. So what are we going to cover in the next 45 minutes? Well, we'll be looking at the resume itself and how it fits into the overall application. Then that application form, which as you will see, can be very, very detailed and a real chance for you to share additional aspects of who you are and your background and experience. Then, as I said, going beyond job titles, how do you showcase that professional experience that you hope will earn you a place in the MBA classroom? There's all of the academic background going well beyond transcripts and GPA, and then extracurriculars and community engagement. Remember, some business schools specifically ask, how will you contribute to the community? That's a great way to showcase things that you've done. And we always like to consider some of the pitfalls. My colleagues, of course, working at the world's top business schools have seen fantastic applications and things that really didn't work out. We can share some of those throughout. I hope that you will bring in your own questions. I'll try to feed them into the conversations that we have. But Caroline, I'm going to start with you just to get into the resume itself and the role that it plays in the overall MBA application.
Yes, thank you, Matt. So the resume is really critical. So it will often be the first thing that the file reader will look at. So when the file reader first looks at your application, either they will look at the resume or they'll look at the application form first. So it's one or the other, and we're talking about both today. So that's really your opportunity to make a first impression, right? You get one shot at making a first impression. So it is really critical. The resume should be a snapshot of what you bring to business school. And as you said, Matt, it is different from applying for a job. So you should think about what it is that you bring to school. Obviously, they will be looking at your professional accomplishments, but they are also looking at your academic achievements. You're applying to an academic institution after all. So whereas with a job application, they may be paying more attention to your professional accomplishments. It's really important to showcase your academics as well in that resume. And of course, they will be looking at what else you bring to the school. How are you going to engage in the community? And so those extracurriculars, those examples of community involvement in your resume will be really important. And so it's important that those key messages come across quickly. And they'll also be looking at the resume from the perspective of a future recruiter. So even though, as I said, this style of resume is a little bit different from applying for a job, schools want to admit candidates who will flourish on the program, but also who will be successful in landing a job post MBA and in achieving their career ambitions. So they will look at the resume in the context of what it is that you want to do post MBA. And they'll be looking at, okay, well, if I was a recruiter at McKinsey or a private equity fund or Goldman Sachs, is this CV going to be appealing? Would I want to interview this candidate? Right. So that's also very important that comes across. So lots of things to be thinking about. At the minimum, you need to show in that resume that you're a viable candidate, right? So if the resume is not well done, then they may spend very little time at all on the rest of your application. Unfortunately, schools, they're incredibly busy dealing with huge volumes of applications. So if your resume or your application form really lets you down, then they may just scan through the rest of your application extremely quickly. And even if you've got the best essay in the world and you tell an amazing story there, they might not pay a huge amount of attention to it, right? They might read it quite quickly because they may rule you out pretty fast after that initial impression. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to really nail those aspects. And it's often something, unfortunately, that I think candidates leave too late in the process because it's easy to spend a lot of time on the essays, and the essays are, quite frankly, often more interesting than crafting a resume or filling out all of those fields in the application form. And the essays are very important. But when I was at INSEAD, we would see candidates who had clearly spent a lot of time on some aspects of their application, but had rushed the resume or the application form at the last minute. And you would see issues like, spelling mistakes or just inconsistent data, and that can really let you down. So I'm glad that this group is here today, and hopefully none of the candidates here will make that mistake.
Well, Caroline, I had once given myself a GMAT math question, a quant question, and I was asking myself, so if Caroline was the director of admissions of INSEAD for 7 years, and it's one of the most selective and attractive business schools in the world, I think that you probably saw about 34,000 applications during your time and had a final say on all of those. You speak about perhaps using the resume as part of this piquing the curiosity, then leading to a deeper read of other aspects. And in another masterclass with Sharon on the essays, we were saying, think about what they need to know versus what's nice to know. So is it very much, this is to get you the interview. We want to meet this candidate.
Yes, and that's true of the whole application, right? It's the written application in some ways is a teaser, so that the next step is, of course, that they want to invite you to interview. And that's absolutely true of the resume. So it should entice them to want to dig in further. Because I said, if it doesn't entice them, then they won't spend a lot of time on the rest of your application, and that's really a shame. So it should be something that will entice them to then spend more time on your recommendations, on reading your essays, on looking at the whole context of your application. And they will look at that, right? They're not going to ditch everything just having glanced at the resume, but they will definitely spend more time on some applications than others. And as I said, that resume is that critical first impression for setting the stage for the rest of your application, and for setting the stage also for the context of your essays. So I also encourage candidates to work on the resume or the application form at the start of the process rather than the end, because given that that's the way that the file reader will look at your application, they will look at those elements first. The context should flow from there. And I find it very difficult to read an essay without having already read the resume or the application form, because you need that context to understand the bigger picture of the candidate. And so it's really setting the stage for your whole presentation.
Great. Jody, you'll be giving us some examples, some very specific examples in a few minutes of how to showcase your professional experience. But with all of your experience, your colleagues at Wharton, Georgetown, and elsewhere, do we start reading from the top down? Or do you know that people like to start down at the bottom and work their way up? They start with the fun stuff. What do you think draws the eye?
I think in my experience, the eye is going to go to your current job, which is the first thing. Where are you right now? And you get a sort of just a general, okay, they're in this industry, or they're an entrepreneur, or kind of a general sense of where they are in the world. I'm a big college sports nut, so I tend to go to the college next, just to see if they went somewhere that I like, or that, oh, I like that school, or I don't, or boo, But I like to see where they went to school and what they majored in, just because again, it's sort of a general look at where they are,
Right, so you're getting that big picture. And if we think about a one-page resume and all of the work that you then do with clients, is it to remind them that it's all valuable space?
Yes.
It's not just the headlines up here, but they can be using all of that space.
Yeah, I know I've heard from colleagues too that when they were in admissions, they often went to the bottom first. It's more interesting honestly, than to read about another person that works at, a big bank. What do you do when what do you do that makes you a fun person to be in school with? Why would I want to be on your learning team? Why, how are you going to make the school look good after graduation because you're a leader? And sometimes that last section really brings it home and makes you just honestly like someone. Oh, that's really cool what they do. I want to learn more. I want to have them in an interview. I want to ask them more about their thing.
Well, we're going to be taking a deep dive into all of those different sections, and I know that you've prepared some specific examples for viewers, but the resume, Catherine, it is one of the pieces of the application puzzle. And then whether you call it a biodata form or an application form, there is something that the school itself has designed to get a lot of specific information about a candidate. So talk us through that application and how important it really is.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important. But it's also important to think of your application overall as a sum of its parts and not view them completely separately. The online application is, as you mentioned, quite detailed. It is not the most fun part of applying to business school. And because there's not a common application, you're going to be filling out similar information over and over and over again from multiple schools. And so to Caroline's point, this is not something we should put off to the end, because that certainly does lead to, small mistakes such as, forgetting a period, or bigger mistakes where we are misspelling words, or even worse, contradicting something that is on the resume or in, another part of the application. So it's really important to start early and think about it in terms of complementing what is on the resume and other areas of the application. I agree with Caroline. When I am working with clients, I start with the resume and the online application first. It's something that kind of, again, not the most fun parts of the process. People like to get into the essays, but very important foundational data. When you think about complementing, for example, there's the professional section where you're going to enter things similar to the resume, like your job title, your salary, which isn't typically included on a resume, years that you've worked there, et cetera. But in the online application, they're asking for, your roles and responsibilities, right? So this is a place where you can enter, overall what you're responsible for, day to day in your position, whereas the resume is a chance to build on that with, here's what I've accomplished in this particular role. Oftentimes I see people just cut and paste from the resume into the online app, and that's not what we want to do. They should be kind of separate complementing spaces. There's also things like the community engagement section, which, as you mentioned, schools really like to see people who are engaged in the community, who are adding value outside of their work environment. Oftentimes when you've got a one-page resume, there's limited space. So, you know, we include that information. Maybe we have space for a bullet or two, but don't tend to be able to elaborate a ton on that. So the online app is where we can build into that, right? We can include who we're working with and how many hours we're contributing, and also accomplishments that you may not have been able to include.
With the example that you just gave, Catherine, is it a case of know thy school and know thyself? If they've taken the time to include on an application form the opportunity to talk about community engagement or volunteer work or your passions and interests, is it because it's something that the school, it's a signal? You know, we talk about Team Fuqua. It's something that they really care about.
Yes, yes. And at Duke, at Fuqua, you know, it is incredibly important, and it is rare to see candidates admitted who don't have some sort of engagement with the community. And sometimes that's hard when you're a consultant and you're working, you know, 100 hours a week. So we need to be thoughtful and reflect on areas, whether it's formally or informally, that you've been able to give back.
I think it also validates if you have a career vision that says, I really want to work on sustainable technology, but your resume doesn't have that.
Right.
It creates a disconnect. And so they need to be consistent. So you volunteer maybe at an environmental organization, just anything to sort of validate what you have said on the other parts of the application, to me, is really important. Otherwise you don't seem sincere with your, you know, with your career goals if you haven't aligned them. And then the extra section is sometimes a good place to do that.
Right. And we loosely sometimes say, Catherine, oh, you know, Harvard only has one essay. London Business School only has one essay. INSEAD famously, of course, has 7. Thank you, Caroline, for that. But there's also the reality with these application forms, lots of, what should we call them, mini essays, you know, these text boxes that you really, again, want very thoughtful and very thorough answers from the candidate.
Yes, yes. And I think that's another situation, you know, where people put it off to the last minute, and then, oh my gosh, you know, Darden has the question about where you would travel and why, and it's, you know, incredibly short, you know, character count. And so, yeah, I mean, it's important to put thought into these things and make sure they're complementing, as Jody said, things in your story that, you know, that resonate. So we don't want to pick just a random place that you haven't been able to visit, right? We want to connect it to your career goal in some way, or something that's, you know, woven in from a personal standpoint to resonate with the reader.
Right, right. Jody, one question that's come up a lot, because the application form, the school has pretty much determined its length and its format, and then you provide answers for each of those. But with the resume, a number of viewers have said, you know, 1 page versus 2 page. Maybe I'm a little older candidate with 8 years of experience, and so it would trend towards a 2-page CV or resume. For the business school application, are we really trying to get everything down to 1 page? And when is the exception acceptable?
My understanding is a lot of the applications online won't even accept a 2nd page, I think, in some cases. But the only time a 2-page resume is okay is if it's an executive MBA program, in my personal opinion. Just because they tend to allow it. Most applications will say 1 page, like they're pretty strict about it. And it's a very frustrating, that's very, very hard for a lot of candidates, because there's some great stuff. So the 1-page limit is really hard, but in my opinion, not negotiable.
So perhaps again, it brings us
program at all.
Why we would look at both the resume and the application form.
Right. And think, okay, where can I elaborate in my essay? Where can I elaborate somewhere else? What can I save to bring to the interview? What, you know, maybe I'll put something eye-catching and have a backup story kind of ready to go if it comes up in the interview. You have other chances to elaborate. What you need to do is grab the attention and lead them to ask more questions. But it's hard. The 1-page thing is hard, but you really can't go over. You just can't.
I will say, just getting to like mistakes and checking things thoroughly within the online application. Sometimes if you're uploading a Word doc, it will not format to a page. So making sure that, you know, you're uploading a PDF if possible, and preserving that formatting so that it doesn't appear that you ignored the 1-page role.
You heard it here first in the middle of June and not 2 hours before the round one deadline. And Caroline, just briefly, because of course, you were working in tech, and in the last quarter of 2022, we saw big layoffs from Microsoft, Twitter. People will have gaps in their resume, and that would spill over to the area on your career record. Just perhaps briefly from you, are we trying to explain that on the resume, or do we, put it as it is and use other areas of the application to explain if there is a possible gap?
Yeah, it's something that often comes up, and it's absolutely fine to apply to business school if you're not employed. It often happens when there are waves of layoffs that people will be applying to business school, because that can be a great time to head off to graduate school, right? When the job market isn't great. And so don't feel bad about that. Schools are used to seeing that type of profile. I think that, if you've been laid off and you're doing something else, perhaps you're volunteering or you're working on a side hustle project, then that could well be worth including that on the resume. Otherwise, there are usually spaces on the application form, or there's usually an optional essay where you can explain the gap and what you've been doing with your time. So I would say it's important to address it. Sometimes candidates hope that the admissions committee might not notice something that's missing from their application, and you can be sure that they will notice. And it's very irritating for the file reader when something isn't addressed and it's sort of swept under the carpet, and that will be the thing that they focus on. So do be upfront about things. Don't hope that they will not notice something like a gap in your resume. So do address it, but don't feel bad about it. Just address it in a straightforward way. You don't need to make a big song and dance about it. I would also say that if you have been laid off and you're planning to apply to business school, try to do something productive with that time, right? It looks better if you have been perhaps, helping out at a friend's startup, or doing a volunteer project, or doing some fundraising. That you have been productively using that time. That will look much better than if you have, not been doing anything, and there's not much that you can say about what you've been doing in that intervening period. Because they will also be thinking about how is that gap going to look to a future recruiter, right? And so try to use that time productively. But there are lots of ways that you could use that time productively.
Great. Now, we said that we would take a deep dive in some very specific examples. So I'm going to turn to Jody, and I'll screen share again so that we can look at some of these specific examples. And here it's how to showcase your professional experience. So it's not just, here's the company name, I'm a junior associate, and here are the dates. And Jody, you've got some specific examples for us to take a look at. So take us through those.
So this is an example of something that I see very, very often, and just delete it all. You don't need
that's quick and simple.
You don't need, the basic message here is you don't need to describe what you do, especially if you have a job that is a very common precursor to business school, for example, banking or brand marketing or something. This can be very frustrating because there's things that you spend a lot of time doing, probably day to day, that don't need to go on the resume. And that can be a frustrating piece. But especially if you're trying to stick to one page and you have a job that, as you were saying, you review hundreds of these every month. You see a lot of associates, you see a lot of analysts, you know what they do. We're familiar with the industries. Things like I did all these sort of routine tasks make you seem the same as everyone else that has your title. So there's no reason to admit you over somebody else that has the same title. Think about the person sitting next to you at work and why you're better than them as a candidate, why you're a better performer. That's basically what you want to be thinking of. If you're just listing your job description, you're the same as the person next to you, more or less, on paper, right? So
some of these specific examples of due diligence and analysis and product evolution.
So I'm hoping we have a next slide of improving on this and what the difference would be.
Before and then the after, right?
Yes. So, okay, so this is more of a technical example. I mean, you can read it on your own time, but basically we've added Fortune 500 companies. You're saving your clients money and you're generating follow-on business for the firm. Obviously, this is a much stronger way to position yourself. You can also replace something general with one specific example. I performed a cost analysis for, one of the top 5, insurance companies in the country, and this was the outcome. If confidentiality is a problem, you can use percentages, you can use approximations. You don't want to disclose anything that is privileged, for sure. But any data that shows that what you did helped the firm in a business way is much, much stronger than just saying you fulfilled the basic responsibility of your job. When you come out of business school, you are probably going to be at a higher level than you were when you went in. So they want to show that you can appreciate the bigger picture because you're going to be managing people that are doing your job now. So they want to see that, I think, that you can understand your piece in the bigger picture of the business.
So
if you had a little piece of a project that eventually led to, new revenue, you can spell that out, say led the analysis team that eventually developed this and that and this. You can kind of outline how your part fit in to the bigger picture too, even if it wasn't I definitely, was the only person responsible. So think about why you're better than the person with the same title sitting next to you.
So in this case, they've detailed the clients, without being indiscreet, they've detailed, these were big companies, Fortune 500.
Right.
But outcomes, right? It led to a saving, and you've put a number to that. And equally, the fact that that follow-on business, which implies presumably that you did a great job. Right.
And that your managers trusted you with real work. I mean, they gave you real work to do that mattered. They weren't just keeping you busy. You had responsibility that was significant. And if you just state that you had a lot of responsibility, it's not as credible. But if you add the numbers, there's no denying it. So again, these are some examples. This is more of a consultant one, probably. So the other thing is the quantification, the numbers. If you just visually, if you're a super, super busy person and you looked at the top 3 bullets and you looked at the bottom 3 bullets, when you look at the bottom, you're going to see dollar signs, numbers, more dollar signs. And if you're just glancing, just visually, it looks like this person has better quant skills, honestly. And again, that you understand impact. And these are big numbers. If you're just taking a scan, wow, $400,000, wow. I mean, even if you just walk away with that, as opposed to bullets that don't have any quantification, when you read the ones without the numbers, you think, well, they just did their job and went home. Yeah. When you read the bottom 3 bullets, you think this person really was significant. So any numbers you can add, things like if you conduct training classes, how many people took the training class? If you conducted interviews, roughly how many, and you can use approximately, you can use on average, it doesn't have to be exact because it can vary. The other option you have is the second bullet here, chronic managing a cybersecurity benchmarking project worth da-da-da. You can pick a specific example. If some of your work is not great, is not significant, but one big project is, you only have to list the big significant project. You don't have to list all the others. Right. Even if they took up a lot of your time, which can be frustrating. You really want to limit yourself to the impact. Again, the quick read, this person's going to go, wow, this person was really important to their company. They generated results that were measured. I see a lot of resumes that'll say, I really developed great analytical skills by conducting this analysis. But you need to flip that and look at it from the perspective of the employer, of the company. How did you help them? How did you deliver benefit to your managers and the firm? Rather than how did you gain skills, you have to turn it and think of the value that you created. And if you're a tiny little company or a startup, the dollar signs may not be huge, but you can use percentages, increased users by 10% last month, anything to show numbers which are objective and not up to interpretation. You did it, it's quantified. This can be very hard. This can be hard, but it really, really, really makes a difference. Yeah, no, I just comparing these two and how your eye is attracted to these numbers. So Caroline, if I can bring in a comment that we had from you at the beginning of getting the school interested in you and hopefully securing the interview. Some interviews with business schools are performed blind, an alum that doesn't have your resume in front, but an admissions officer may well. Do you think also that by sharing some of these numbers, as Jody has pointed out,
it will then prompt conversations in the interview. Wow, I saw that you trained over 250 new hires. How was that? Does it lead to those sort of conversations?
Yeah, it's a very good point. In most cases, the interviewer will, at the minimum, have read your resume, and they might only have read your resume, right? So it's a very good point that this is a really critical foundation for the discussion at interview stage. And it's the first impression that you make to the admissions file reader, but it's also the first impression that you may make on your interviewer. And so having some great points here that they can dig into will really help you have a good discussion at that interview stage.
A couple of questions, Jody, just coming from our viewers. For an engineering candidate, so perhaps they're thinking about some of the technological advances that a project may have involved.
Yeah.
Should they be trying to frame their projects in a business way? That's BK that asked.
Yes, and that can be frustrating too, because the technical skills that someone probably has are not easy and very significant. However, on a resume for this specific purpose, you kind of need to, I don't want to say dumb it down. I want to say use language that a regular person would understand about your work. Take a bigger picture view. If you developed a tool that was part of a product and it took a ton of technical skills to build the tool, what you actually need to focus on is the product and did it generate revenue? And that can be frustrating because it means a lot of your work is sort of, you want to say, I did a lot. You really want to take a step out and look at the company and how you benefited the company. And again, even if you were a tiny piece, if you built a tool that was part of a product, you can frame it and be very clear about that. Say, I wasn't the only reason this product generated $1 million, but my piece eventually was implemented in something that drove revenue to the company. And that tells the reader that you worked on something real, something important, and something that boosted the company's performance. And that's significant. But the technical specs can be omitted because the reader is probably not going to understand what you're talking about. Engineers are not reading this. And that's a huge part of our work a lot of times with technical backgrounds. And it can be frustrating, but it's critical because if you go on and on about technical specs, it's not going to get appreciated by this audience, Bring it back in when you're applying for a job, bring it all back. But for right now, you got to sort of take one step back and think about why was your boss's boss, thrilled with what you did? How did that impact their life and their performance?
And again, perhaps through that lens with R&D that then never sees the product stage. It's not on the shelves of Best Buy, or it's a plug-in software that didn't find its way into the final application. Let's talk about projects that they worked with that perhaps were cancelled at some point or never saw the light of day. And how they frame that.
That happens with M&A too. I think you can look at scope. You can look at also the other piece that we haven't even talked too much about yet is team management and collaboration with other folks. If you worked on a project team or led a project team, that's a huge asset too. Even if the product failed, you were given the responsibility to manage people even on a project basis. That's a huge component that you want to build in as much as you can, especially with a technical background, because it balances that nicely. You can look at budget numbers. This project had a certain budget. You can look at cost savings or ways you innovated within the project management. It's a tricky one, but it can be done. And even if the product failed because of the market or because something else happened, you can still talk about the scope of what you did using budget numbers, using staff. Maybe you worked with people from another country and that kind of diversifies your background. Think about what made it a growth point for you.
If we take a look at these examples, and Catherine, sorry, I'm going to bring you in just a moment. Here we are on a geospatial data-driven visual dashboard. My head is already spinning for a major bank. And we talk about, it's then being applied across 600 branch offices. We talk about revenues. We're also thinking at some point there might well be a recommender, either from the client or from First National Bank, if that's where you're working. So is how the resume and perhaps some of those numbers then speak to this point that you're saying your boss was delighted with the results, your contribution to that project. And this is setting the scene maybe for some of the things they will share in their recommendation.
Yes. And also, I mean, these examples are really, really strong. You mean every one of your bullets might not have all of these components, but you need to have at least a couple that grab the eye with the big numbers and put those first. You're probably not going to have 6 examples with billion-dollar numbers in them, but you want to at least lead with the strongest ones. And a real quick note about what you said about the recommender. That's the other reason you really want to respect confidentiality on here, because it could be seen by someone at that company or someone at your company. It can get, you never know, right? It's a public document. So you really, really want to not disclose anything that is privileged. But if it's not privileged, go for it. And run it by your boss if you're not sure. But that's another, just your point about you never really know who, you're not sure who may eventually see this. So you've got to be careful about that, which again can be frustrating.
Calls from the Pentagon and the CIA before talking to candidates about applying to business school. They're interested to know what they'll be talking about. Catherine, before we look at this final slide and the sort of the before and after effect, you're going to make a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say with the technical teams too, something to think about is working cross-functionally, right? So showing that you're able to collaborate, not just lead teams, but also collaborate with people from other functions within the organization and other levels within the organization, especially when you think about the importance of teamwork in an MBA program.
Right. On this one, the verbs, developed, every bullet. The second one, we brought in implementation, creation. Again, as we think about the different characteristics, what you'll bring to the MBA classroom, is this again, Jody, a prompt of how I think and on multiple levels?
Right. And you want to show, to the extent that you can, that you innovated, that you didn't just, again, fulfill the job, that you created a solution that maybe no one else thought of, or initiated a solution. Or a lot of this is sometimes internal stuff like D&I committees or internal training, and took it upon myself to train all the interns on something because I noticed that they didn't know how to do something. Things that you saw problems and identified them proactively. And that's where words like created, initiated, designed, this is original work that you came up with that had, again, a measured impact, right? That benefited your firm. That's a huge piece too. You didn't just sit down, fulfill your job, and go home. You were looking for solutions. You were finding new things to help the company.
I know that our coaches at Fortuna, we talk a lot about patterns of behavior, whether it's in your academic, your professional, your community. So initiating things and how that might run across many chapters of your life. And now we're going to look at those other aspects beyond professional to present your academics and the extracurriculars. So Catherine, talk us through how you might really optimize sharing your education.
Yeah, I think with the education, and this is again quite different from applying to a job outside versus applying to business school, where a lot of these things would not be included on a resume. But when you're thinking about your MBA resume, we want to include things like involvement on campus. So, here, we can list things like your study abroad. Obviously, that's international exposure, which is wonderful. Awards that you got, this one was specifically, towards CSR, which this person, likely was moving in that direction. So again, showing that, continued interest. Obviously, involvement with sports is great. If you're playing a sport officially for the school, but also including things like club sports and, service fraternities and anything that shows that you are getting involved on campus, because as an admissions person reading this resume, I want to see that involvement, because then I assume you will be involved within the MBA community as well. You can obviously include your GPA if you'd like. And another thing that I always, people are unsure if they can include in this section is any unofficial or outside training that you have done since graduating. So Coursera courses, let's say, you don't have a strong background in finance, so you take an accounting course through Coursera, or you take MBA math to get prepared to show that you're working towards admission. You can put those things within the education section as well. With the extracurriculars, obviously we have, like in this case, big brothers and big sisters. So you may be volunteering with large, well-known nonprofits, and in general, a bullet there is fine, because we know, what those organizations do. I think it's important to think about things like, maybe if your community involvement isn't as strong, being on a DEI initiative at work, or the women's leadership initiative at your company. Those are things that we can pull in here, as well as unofficial things that you have done on your own. So let's say you started, going back to sustainability, but you started a recycling initiative within your company, or I had a client a year ago who she got friends and family together and collected cell phones for underprivileged children in India who needed them to do their virtual schooling during COVID. So we can include those things even if they're not an official role with a large nonprofit. And these are things, to Caroline's point, that spark conversation, especially with an interviewer who maybe this is all they're seeing of your application.
Anyone that's walked down Congress Avenue in Austin will immediately be drawn to the food truck connoisseurs and maybe Amy's ice cream. But let me just take you through some of the details, because for the women's lacrosse team, it's all 4 years. And perhaps we could all sign up for 1 semester, but then things drop. If you have shown that level of commitment, whether to a team at university or something else that you've done, it's an opportunity to share with the adcoms the commitment that you've made, right?
Yes. And I think detail in general is something that we want to include, whether that's, in the education section or below with the additional information, not just saying I love to travel, but including things like, I've traveled to all 50 states or, in 10 countries, so that people really have something to hold on to that shows something more about the type of person that you are, or the interests that you have. I would also say, and I can't believe I have to say this, but it is important to be 100% truthful and be ready to talk about anything that you've included in this section. So being honest with yourself, if it's an organization that you're putting down, but you really haven't done anything with in a couple of years, it's not going to be a great look if they ask you about it and you don't have a lot to say. Or when I was at Fuqua, I remember one time, and this was interviewing for internships, but the person had, I love to read, and the interviewer asked them what the most recent book they read was, and they had nothing. So, these things are, you have to be ready to talk about it. And it is a way to make a personal connection, which ultimately, when it comes to an interview, people interview people, and they want, it's not scientific. These things can really make a difference when it comes to somebody advocating for you later on in the process.
Yeah, we said at the beginning of the workshop, don't sell yourself short. And of course, we do these lengthy calls with individuals thinking about their own business school plans. Take them very, very seriously. Today, talking to an extraordinarily talented McKinsey associate. And he said, but of course, I work such long hours and I really haven't volunteered much. He takes me back to his final year at one of the top universities in the UK, founded a group for refugees to provide them opportunity to education. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, I guess every couple of months, I organize board meeting. There was a whole bunch of stuff that he was still doing, but somehow he dismissed it. And I see that with Big Brother, Big Sister, it wasn't just the 10-year-old girl, that's already great, but you met weekly. And again, the signal to me is you really cared about this, and you've showed up week after week. So fantastic. Great. Okay, so those are some of those examples. Now, Caroline, you once gave me an example of an Italian applying to INSEAD. We won't go into the pitfalls of what was on that individual's CV, but it did stick in my mind. What are some of the things that we should avoid?
Now you're muted.
Sorry about that. My dog was barking. So I think we've covered some of them, but as we've said, attention to detail is really important, not leaving these elements to the last minute. As we've said, some of the applications do have a lot of free text fields in the application form itself that are essentially mini essays and do require quite a bit of thought and preparation, as Catherine said. And I think that the application forms have got longer as essays have got shorter over the years. And so that's something that is really critical. And then making sure that your presentation is coherent. Sometimes you'll read data on application form and the dates don't exactly match what is on the resume, right? So just, it's quite tedious to go through and check all of that, but do go through that very carefully because those things can really jump out to a file reader. And it's a good idea to have somebody else go through and proofread it for you as well, because I think when you've been working on an application, and often, candidates work on this over several months, at the end of the day, it can be hard to see the wood for the trees, and it's very easy to miss your own errors. So do get someone else involved in helping you with that. And then I think making sure some of those key messages come out, right? So sometimes the CV could be too crammed with information because you've tried to get everything into that one page that Jody was talking about. And so you condensed it into, a tiny font and the page is absolutely full of text. That can be quite off-putting for the file reader. So make sure that it's easy on the eye, that there is some clear white space, that it's nicely formatted and you've really chosen your words very carefully, so that it's easy to digest and not off-putting for the file reader to look at. A typical mistake that I've seen candidates make often is using too much jargon, as we said, using too much technical language. It's important to think about who your audience is and that they may not be familiar with a field that is technical. So if they start reading technical language, that can really make their eyes glaze over. And remember that they might be looking at your resume or your application form after having plowed through 25 other applications, and it's the end of the day. So you need to think about how you can grab their attention and appeal to someone who might not be familiar with your field. Or as we've also said, if you are another McKinsey, Bain or BCG consultant, don't state the obvious about what you do, because that will also make them glaze over. So really focus on, as we've said, the achievements and not just stating the tasks and the basics of your experience. And then, something else that candidates sometimes miss is the opportunity to show their fit with the school through that resume and through the application form. So, for example, INSEAD, international experience is very important, right? They're looking for people who have a real international orientation and have sought out opportunities to get international experience. And so making sure that comes across clearly in your resume and your application form is very important. Sometimes candidates sort of miss those opportunities and don't highlight that clearly enough. And every school has something that, specific about what they're looking for. So make sure that you've thought about that fit for that specific school. Harvard is passionate about leadership. So make sure that those leadership examples are very clearly highlighted in both your resume and your application form. And they don't have to sort of dig and read between the lines to try and figure that out. Or if you're applying to Wharton, that the importance of that collaboration, the teamwork, the interpersonal skills, that jumps out. And it's not sort of assumed in what you're saying about your job. And I think, another mistake that I see people make is focusing too much on the professional side in their resume. It's nice to have a balance in that one page between your professional accomplishments, your educational accomplishments, and your extracurriculars, right? And those extracurriculars can often be something that the interviewer might pick up on as an icebreaker, right? We were looking at the extracurriculars just now, and food truck connoisseur. Well, that would probably be the first thing I would pick up on, right? Tell me about what you love about food trucks, and what was your last favorite meal from a food truck. So having something there that can be a good opportunity to just initiate a discussion, and pique their interest, and avoiding having those generic interests that you mentioned at the start, Matt, that are probably very common and are not going to particularly pique anyone's interest. And then just with the formatting, I don't like seeing funky formatting. I don't like seeing crazy colors on a resume. Keep it clean, keep it professional, keep it in a format that is standard. A lot of business schools will publish examples of resumes or a template that you can use. So just take advantage of that, because they will also be looking at your resume, as we've said, with the eyes not just of the admissions committee and the school, but also future recruiter. And do you look professional in your presentation? So the resume is not a place to get really creative with your artistic skills.
So given that we're in the pitfall section, I would just like to say to the food truck connoisseurs, the interview is not the opportunity to show up with mustard or with ketchup on your upper lip. But if I bring in, Jody, a couple of points that Caroline has made about format and content. So yeah, we're not going to use font size 7 and what, 1/8 of an inch footers and headers to squeeze all of this in. But perhaps a candidate has been working, 4 or 5 years. They were a year in their first firm, maybe 2 years at the second and then the third firm. In terms of balance, would you expect to find more information in the most recent role, assuming that they all have comparable periods of time that reflect the growing levels of responsibility that the candidate has?
Yeah, that's advice I give a lot, is you want especially the experience section to be what I call top heavy. Your current position should have the most bullets. And this is a good tip when you're trying to cut down length. Not only is it more likely that someone's going to read the stuff at the top, and then sort of by the end, they're like, if they're tired, they may not get to it all, to be frank. So you really want the top to be the strongest. And visually, it looks as though, okay, as they advanced, they took on more responsibility. It's a visual maneuver. So when you're thinking about what can I cut to make it to one page, I generally advise cut from the earlier positions first. You can have a position without any bullets if it was an internship or maybe your first job somewhere. You don't even have to put any bullets if you kind of just were a new employee and went through a training program or did something that didn't have a chance to really do a whole lot. That's okay too. If that helps you save space. You really want to think about each entry as being, why is this important to my next step? And if you don't have anything, leave it off, right? And make sure that what you're doing now is the most significant work you've done so far.
Yeah,
hopefully, or most recently. Again, if you're on a break, that's one thing, but you really want to show that you advanced. And that's another reason to be very clear about your timeline, the dates of each position, because what people often look for is, did they have the same job for 3 years and never got promoted? That's a bad sign. You want to show your advancement on a timeline. And that's, if you leave it off, again, it just looks a little bit like, what are they hiding?
I think that's why expert insider guidance is so valuable, because we're anxious. We want to put our best foot forward, but sometimes less is more, or enables us to spend more time on the most important things. Catherine, you had talked about in the education section, maybe Coursera, and one of our viewers has said, do they need to be official certified earned courses? Now, if I step back before looking at the certified element, business schools are looking for curious people, right? So, I mean, is there kind of, well, we hope that you're interested in your continued learning curiosity, whether it's expressed through Coursera or any other format?
Yes, exactly. Showing that curiosity and continuous learning, whether that is a formal certification process or whether that's simply taking a course. And with Coursera, not all courses have a certification that go along with them. So simply taking, an intro to accounting or statistics or, anything like that, we list it and the completion date. And sometimes there's an option to pay a little bit to get a grade. So if you got an A, you can say, hey, I got an A in this. class with this Darden professor who taught on Coursera, but it's not necessary.
Yeah. Okay, great.
And you
One
can list
final
things,
question.
and that's a chance too.
Bill,
Like I've seen people that have gotten certified in yoga instruction or wine sommelier, something along those lines, which I don't know a lot about, but it seems cool. Like things that you've done outside professionally that are, again, it signifies your commitment, right? You really, you don't just write, I'm really interested in whatever. You've gotten trained in it, or you teach a class in it, or you attend a weekly class in, you know, beer brewing or something. Like it's not just something words on a page, it's really actively what you do. And that'll help encourage conversation.
Yeah, and those are things that you can include in essays, like how will you give back? It doesn't always have to be, you know, a strong, you know, it can be a personal story. Like I'm going to start a yoga club, or I'm going to, you know, partner with this other club to offer yoga as a wellness opportunity for my classmates. Like we can weave that in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think it's a great example. You know, when Wharton specifically asks how you'll contribute to the community, or if we think about, you know, INSEAD is doing 2 years of networking in 1 year. So you work hard in the classroom and you play hard. And if that's the wellness of yoga or discovering French wines together, or a fintech club or a professional pursuit, presumably all of these things come together to make you a richer, more attractive candidate. Well, you've managed to share so much in the last 55 minutes. I mean, this typifies the joy that I have of working with Fortuna. It's just a constant flow of insight and conversation. I'd mentioned to you, viewers, just how seriously we take the conversations that we then have with you about your own hopes and dreams, applying to business school, post-MBA career visions, drawing on the background of this dream team at Fortuna, whether from the top schools from the US or internationally. And we make sure that that's very honest advice, because of course, my colleagues were actually in that admissions office and the things that they share. So please reach out to us for your own free consultation at fortunaadmissions.com. We'd love to look through and really prepare that discussion and have a very worthwhile and helpful discussion. This was the third masterclass in a series. 2 weeks ago, we started with the essays. That was an amazing session. The one last week about recommenders and who to ask for a really powerful letter of recommendation. Just a ton of great questions, as we also had today. So please use all of those resources, whether it's school specific or different aspects of the application. It's all drawing on this extraordinary insider expertise and insight of my colleagues at Fortuna Admissions. So of course, it just remains for me to thank Jody, to thank Catherine, and to thank Caroline for another wonderful session. And we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.